Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark, and the book I will review today is The Unbearable Lightness of Being. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of The Unbearable Lightness of Being with leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself if you are interested. Now let's get back to the review. The Unbearable Lightness of Being is a 1984 novel by the Czech writer Milan Kundera. I think it was first published in French and then it was translated into Czech by Kundera himself. Kundera in his younger days was an idealist, not uncommon choice when one lacks experience and wisdom of age. He became a member of a communist party when it took power in Czechoslovakia after World War II and believed it could be good for the country. But he became disillusioned when the reality of communist oppression replaced his romantic idea of it. The Warsaw-Pact invasion in 1968, the result of the Prague Spring, was probably the end of any hope Kundera might have had for Czechoslovakia. And a few years later he went into exile and basically escaped, as back then it was the only way to leave Eastern Europe. He settled in Paris, which was the preferred place for many Eastern European intellectuals and artists running away from oppression. In Paris, probably feeling free and unhampered, he did his best writing, originally in French, so that's why he is considered by many a French writer. I am sure for Czechs he is Czech, similar to Kafka, who was Czech but wrote in German. Kafka was a great influence on Kundera. What is the unbearable lightness of being about? It is about individual lives as affected by love and desire and need for freedom while living under totalitarian control. On the grander scale, it is one cycle in the Nietzsche's eternally repeating cycles of life. The heavier the burden, the closer our lives come to the earth, the more real and truthful they become. Conversely, the absolute absence of burden causes man to be lighter than air, to soar into heights, take leave of the earth and his earthly being, and become only half real, his movements as free as they are insignificant. What then should we choose, weight or lightness? And that's the dilemma facing the protagonists. The plot leads to the reflection on the more spiritual side of life, the acceptance of weight or suffering for a chance of or a shot at happiness. A bit of the plot. The plot revolves around the lives of 4 people and a dog. There is Thomas, a doctor and womanizer, split between sex and love. Teresa, Thomas's wife, somewhat disconnected from the physical existence. Sabina, Thomas's lover, who somewhat, contrary to Teresa, takes pleasure in making her life as physical as possible. Later appears Franz, a Western intellectual and a victim of Sabina, and the dog, Karenin, who goes through his own parallel cycle of existence. There's also Simon, Thomas's son from his early marriage, who he decides to abandon. The book is divided into 7 parts. The first part, Lightness and Weight, begins explaining Nietzsche's idea of life's eternal return, and we are introduced to Thomas, who meets Teresa. They get married and adopt a dog. But Thomas continues with his sexual adventures, including Sabina. It all takes place around Prague Spring and the Warsaw-Pact invasion of the country, forcing all of them to leave for Switzerland. But Teresa is not happy with Thomas's doings and returns to Prague. And Thomas, not being able to find a way to live without her, follows. Part 2, Soul and Body, uses Teresa as the narrator and tells it from her point of view. It also explores Teresa by giving a bit of her biography, her family growing up, meeting Thomas, and becoming photographer, befriending Sabina, and the two photographing each other in nude. Part 3, Words Misplaced, tells the story from Sabina's perspective. She meets Franz, who is in a marriage of convenience, and seduces him, and she continues with her further adventures in France and then the US, and she starts to correspond with Simon, Thomas's son, about Thomas and Teresa. In Part 4, Body and Soul, Thomas and Teresa live their lives in the post-invasion Prague, where Thomas is working as a window washer. He is disqualified from being a doctor because of his implied connection to the Prague Spring. Part 5, Lightness and Weight, explains how Thomas lost his job. He has an accidental encounter with his son and moves to the country with Teresa to get away from everything. Part 6, Grand March, explains the meaning of the word kitsch, which can be defined as a certain type of struggle, and it follows Franz's struggle with his own identity. Part 7, Karenin's Smile, focuses on Thomas's and Teresa's life in the country, maturing and awakening, brought by Karenin's battle with old age and mortality. And that's the basic plot. What are my thoughts about the unbearable lightness of being? The book is a good read, very dense, with a lot of ideas squeezed into its pages. It is Nietzsche's ideas of eternal return, which were an important part of his philosophy, made into a novel. But it also questions the validity of that theory. Is life a burden that weighs the individual down to maintain him in the infinite cycles of repetition, or is it lightness which allows one to rise and free himself? The protagonists in the book live one or the other, but in the end it seems the same for all of them, the loss. You can choose only one or the other. This, the burden of repetition, might be the impossibility of change, the experience of life not lived, and the burden we carry during our life cycle that pushes us and does us in seems to be compassion, feeling the pain of the other. For there is nothing heavier than compassion. Not even one's own pain weighs so heavy as the pain one feels with someone, for someone, a pain intensified by the imagination and prolonged by 100 echoes. It doesn't have to be for the humans, since in the novel it seems to be the dog that brings out the strongest feeling of compassion. Also, the compassion is present when we face the choice of running or staying. A person who longs to leave the place where he lives is an unhappy person. Thomas and Teresa stay with the weight, and Sabina fights compassion and runs to feel the lightness. The implied question seems to be, did Thomas choose love or love chose him? It was compassion that chose it for him. When Teresa came to stay with him for the first time, he felt turning her away would be like abandoning his child, and he couldn't do it, since he did abandon his son a decade before. Perhaps in life some things we can only do once, and then they cannot be repeated. So love is also a burden, like compassion, and is part of it. He suddenly recalled from Plato's Symposium, people were hermaphrodites until God split them in two, and now all the helps wander the world over, seeking one another. Love is the longing for the half of ourselves we have lost. Maybe that's why most of us are condemned to the burden of eternal wandering from place to place, person to person. Thomas feels the burden or weight of love and compassion, and he gets a dog for Teresa so the animal can lighten his load and share with him the burden of loving Teresa. That's why he insists the dog, who is female, has a male name, Karenin, instead of Karenina, referring to Teresa's favorite book, Anna Karenina. And Teresa feels her own burden of loving Thomas. She has a dream where he turns into a small, defenseless rabbit, and all she can do is hold him. Does he love me? Does he love anyone more than me? Does he love me more than I love him? Perhaps all the questions we ask of love, to measure, test, probe, and save it, have the additional effect of cutting it short. Perhaps the reason we are unable to love is that we yearn to be loved. That is, we demand something, love, from our partner instead of delivering ourselves up to him, demand free, and ask for nothing but his company. It is her own fight with compassion. But for Sabina, who chose lightness, love becomes sex, and sex for her is violence, a combat. So her life is an unbearable contradiction, an effort to detach, to be able to float upward by taking on the weight of being in control. Once her love had been publicized, it would gain weight, become a burden. And this is unfortunate for Franz, since he could not make her happy, because he saw love as renunciation of strength. Further, Thomas's womanizing is based on his fear of women and burden of love, so he prefers sex because it allows him to maintain emotional distance and control. He says that making love to a woman and sleeping with her are two different things, opposites. Perhaps the decision was made when his ex-wife wouldn't let him see his son. To invalidate her control over his life, he decided never to see the boy again. And that's where Sabina could understand him because she could relate. But then appeared Teresa, who created again the burden of love for him to carry. Thomas tried to get away from it, but never could. He would be sleeping with other women, but he would need to get drunk to do it. And in the end, he accepted his fate. Thomas was separated from Teresa for a period of time and felt the lightness of being, but shortly the weight of love came back and he couldn't resist it and followed Teresa back. Teresa herself doubted Thomas's love but never questioned her own, but in the end she realized he abandoned everything for her, gave up all his light pleasures and accepted the life weighted down. Maybe the example of acceptance of one's life's burden is Thomas's son, Simon, who doesn't seem to hold any kind of grudge or resentment for being abandoned and even pays homage to his father. Simon never liked his mother and always searched for his father. He didn't want to be like his mother and think bad about his father. He would watch his father wash windows and try to create an incidental meeting, but his father would just walk by. He felt his father could not have liked him. On the other hand, he had liked his father, and that was his burden. Teresa also accepts life weighted down by burdens, but her decision seems more involuntary, just the continuation of her mother's life, choosing a man who makes her suffer. Her life also seems to be controlled more by her subconscious, reflected in her dreams and Freud's theories. Her dreams reflect her fears and desires. In one, Thomas is surrounded by naked women, and later one of him turning into a little rabbit, weak, defenseless, and dependent on her. Teresa's struggle might be more related to the sins of her parents. Teresa's mother blamed her for her lost youth and beauty and created a feeling of guilt in her, which needed to be paid for with suffering. Teresa befriends Sabina, probably because she considers her somewhat of a rival and wants to keep her eye on her, and she thinks getting to know Sabina will make her understand Thomas better. The unbearable lightness of being might be about the paradox of free will. Seems we have to choose one or the other, even though our ability to choose seems to be influenced by the events out of our control. Thomas needs to choose the light with Sabina or burden with Teresa, and he's torn between the two. The lightness is appealing and easy, instant gratification, but not satisfying in the long run, like burden. Thomas is an example of choices we have to make in life, instant gratification or possibility of eternal happiness. There is the part when Thomas is presented with a choice of signing a certain paper or not. If he does, his immediate life will become much easier and pleasant, but unfortunately his principles, character, things that seem out of our conscious control don't allow him to do it, and the consequence is burden. The signing doesn't seem that important at the moment, but it does determine Thomas's future trajectory. It is like the tragedy of Goethe's Faust, having to decide to give his soul away in exchange for instant gratification. In the end, as the compensation for their suffering, Thomas and Teresa reach their nirvana, he his and Teresa hers because he reached his by her side, even though the event might feel tragic. But maybe symbolic nirvana is the desirable end and there's nothing after it. The book's plot takes place and is influenced by the events of 1968 Prague Spring. It gives the story its context, the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia to squash down the anti-communist rebellion. Kundera in the book refers to the invaders as Russians, but there were many other countries involved, including my own country of Poland, and I think many Czechs never forgave us for participating in it. Teresa, who is a photographer, was the happiest during the invasion. She was running around, taking photos, risking her life, and it seemed to give meaning to her existence. And after it is over, she feels depressed and wants to leave. So they go to Switzerland, where Sabina already lives. Teresa tries to sell some of her photos to a local newspaper, but for the West, the Prague Spring is already over. It is old news, and the people are not interested in it anymore. Kundera shows the short attention span of the people in the West and their need for new to keep them entertained. On the other hand, the effect and damage to the Czechs goes on for many years. It seems to be Kundera's criticism of the West, the short and superficial interest in the events that don't directly affect them, and their two-dimensional perception of the life and people behind the Iron Curtain. Maybe Kundera is implying that the West lives in its own unbearable lightness, and that's why Sabina chooses to stay there, and Teresa and Thomas go back. Kundera also uses the German phrase kitsch, which was invented in the 19th century's art world to mean cheap copies or imitation of the originals that were not very good in the first place. In the book, the term is broadened to include politics and life in general, and it seems to mean waste of time, resources, etc., etc., and also doing something purely for attention, to drive attention away from what really matters, very widely applied in the politics, especially dictatorships, but used in all political systems. And Sabina is running away from kitsch, but realizes that there is nowhere to hide from it. To sum it up, The Unbearable Lightness of Being is a very good book. For me, in style, drifting between Camus, Kafka, and Saul Bellow, it tackles or portrays life through three subjects: love, which seems to be represented by Thomas; politics, as in totalitarianism, which is represented by Teresa's life; and need for freedom, which probably is best reflected in Sabina. But the subjects overlap and are present to various degrees in each of the main characters. The unwritten question of the novel seems to be what kind of life is worth living, and the message, paradoxically, might be lasting happiness can only be found in the weight of the burden, the struggle and suffering. Perhaps happiness is not the right word, since it seems to be a temporary state. The more appropriate word might be satisfaction or contentment, and it might only be found in accepting our individual burden. She was experiencing the same odd happiness and odd sadness as then. The sadness meant we are at the last station. The happiness meant we are together. The sadness was form, the happiness content. Happiness filled the space of sadness. And further, and therein lies the whole of man's plight. Human time does not turn in a circle, it turns ahead in a straight line. That's why man cannot be happy. Happiness is the longing for repetition. So we should embrace and carry our burden instead of the unbearable lightness, which, like happiness, is only temporary. Maybe that's the whole idea behind the plot. Happiness is lightness and sadness is burden, and sadness or suffering, if we accept it, may contain happiness. The unbearable lightness of being seems to be, maybe not a rebuttal, but a challenge to Nietzsche's theory of eternal return, which states we live our lives exactly the same way an infinite number of times. So it is best if we make it as good as we can the first time around. The question is, how do we know what is the first time around? And if we don't, our effort might be useless since we will live it exactly as before. Also, if it is infinite and there is no end, so there is no beginning as well. The theory is pretty scary and it terrorized Nietzsche since it meant reliving all the pains and sufferings indefinitely. Maybe not if you had a pretty easy life, but it would probably be irrelevant if you had no memory of it. Nietzsche himself probably didn't really believe in eternal return, but used it as a motivation or replacement for Christian beliefs. We should try to live our lives the best possible so the next time it would be as good, instead of believing in some religious afterlife reward. Nietzsche considered he lived in a post-religious world and considered himself one of its pioneers. Kundera seems to believe in the eternal repetition, but considers it a progressive process. Every successful time is a little better or different than the previous one, since we are enriched by the experience of the previous life. Somewhere out in space, there was a planet where all people would be born again. They would be fully aware of the life they had spent on Earth and of all the experiences they had amassed here. And perhaps there was still another planet where we would all be born a third time with the experiences of our first two lives. And perhaps there were yet more and more planets where mankind would be born 1 degree, one life more mature. That was Thomas's version of eternal return. Of course, we here on Earth, planet number 1, the planet of inexperience, can only fabricate vague fantasies of what will happen to a man on those other planets. Will he be wiser? Is maturity within man's power? Can he attain it through repetition? It makes one think about mortality. Is it the end or a passage? There is a pretty good film adaptation of The Unbearable Lightness of Being with Daniel Day-Lewis and Juliette Binoche. Unfortunately, Kundera was not impressed and never again allowed any of his novels to be adapted into films. Probably The Unbearable Lightness of Being or any of his novels are too deep, too subjective to be successfully relayed in only visual manner. Okay, let's talk about the physical book. The book I am holding is a soft cover, which I transformed into a hardcover leather-bound edition. To make the cover, I use grade A, naturally tan hide I buy from a tanner in North Spain. It is the same leather Louis Vuitton uses to make his bags, so it is top quality. I do all the processing of the leather myself. First, I designed the cover, which what I did here. I used the drawing of a man, woman, and a dog walking away together, and for me it kind of encapsulates the plot of the book. This is the back with the blurb, and inside front cover I printed a quote from the book. If you want to see a more detailed video where I explain how I transform paperback into leather-bound hardcover, click on the link in the description. I'll make a maximum of 100 editions of each title. Each one will be numbered and initialed, and the numbers will go in chronological order from 2 up, since number 1 stays with me. The price will be around $100, so if you would like me to make one for you, you can click below on my email and send me a message. I do not guarantee I will do it, since it will depend on the time I have available, access to leather, and if I can get my hands on the copy of the book. Now, if you're not willing to spend the $100, but you still want the book, what you can do is click below on the PayPal link and donate $3 or more to my channel. And for every 100 donations, I will make a lottery and draw one name, and the winner will receive the book. So if you are cheap but feel lucky, this might be the way to do it. Also, your donations give me the extra motivation to make the book reviews, and I appreciate them very much, so thank you in advance. One more thing, when you make your donation, remember to include the title of the book you would like to win. The book itself is beautiful. Visually, it has a very nice texture, it smells great, and the more you handle it, the more beautiful it will become. And it makes a great gift for yourself or somebody who appreciates books. So if you want one, don't snooze or you might lose. Well, that's it. So let's end it here. And until next time, keep your ear close to the ground and read a book. Adios.